The coins in the old woman's hand rattled softly against the diner counter as she counted them for the third time. $2. 4. 10. $14.30. That was all Mrs. Hannah had left until the end of the week. Outside, the winter wind howled through the narrow street, rattling the diner windows like impatient fingers.
Please. Thank you.
Inside, the smell of hot soup and fried onions wrapped around her empty stomach like a cruel reminder. She had planned carefully. One small bowl of soup. Nothing more. But across the diner, something unexpected was happening. A sharply dressed stranger stood beside the manager's desk while voices grew louder. "You ate the steak special," the manager snapped. "You pay now, or I call the police." The stranger didn't argue. He simply stood there, calm and silent. And for reasons she didn't understand yet. Mrs. Hannah slowly pushed her last coins forward and said, "I'll pay for his meal." She had no idea who the man really was. If you're ready for a story about power, dignity, forbidden love, and the sweetest revenge you've ever witnessed, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this channel brings you the most addictive romance stories you won't find anywhere else. Drop a fire in the comments if you're team revenge. And let's get into this story. Mrs. Hannah Park had lived in the same narrow apartment for nearly 30 years. It sat on the third floor of an aging brick building at the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter and the lights dimmer. The stairwell always smelled faintly of dust and old paint, and the radiator pipes groaned through the winter nights like tired bones protesting the cold. Her apartment was small. One room for sleeping. One small kitchenette with a single electric burner. And a window that overlooked an alley where stray cats sometimes gathered near the dumpsters. But Mrs. Hannah had never complained about it. Not even after her husband passed away. In the mornings, she woke before sunrise out of habit more than necessity. For decades she had risen early to prepare breakfast for her husband before he left for work at the construction yard. Even after he was gone, the rhythm of those mornings remained stitched into her bones. She would sit at the small wooden table near the window and make herself a cup of weak tea. Sometimes she would slice half a piece of bread, carefully saving the other half for later. Every meal was measured. Every coin counted. The small pension she received barely covered rent and utilities. Groceries required patience, calculation, and sometimes sacrifice. On difficult weeks, she told herself she simply wasn't hungry. The truth was that hunger had become a quiet companion in her life. It lingered in the background like a soft ache, never loud enough to demand attention, but never fully disappearing either. Still, Mrs. Hannah carried herself with a quiet dignity that many people overlooked. Her gray coat was old but clean. Her shoes were worn but polished. And every morning, before leaving the apartment, she brushed her hair carefully and pinned it into a neat bun the way her husband had always liked. Some habits were too precious to abandon. On most afternoons she volunteered at the small neighborhood church, folding donated clothes or helping sort canned food for families who needed it more than she did. The younger volunteers often wondered why she spent her time helping others when her own life seemed so modest. But Mrs. Hannah rarely spoke about herself. Kindness, to her, had never been something that required explanation. Years ago, when her husband had been injured on a construction site, it was strangers who had quietly stepped in to help them. A coworker who brought groceries. A neighbor who paid for medicine. A shop owner who told them not to worry about the bill. Those small acts had carried them through a very dark winter. Mrs. Hannah never forgot that. And perhaps that was why, even now, she found it impossible to ignore someone else's struggle. That evening had started like many others. The winter air had grown sharp, biting through her thin gloves as she walked slowly down the street toward the diner on the corner. The diner wasn't special. Its neon sign flickered. The windows fogged up from the heat inside. And the bell above the door gave a tired jingle every time someone entered. But it was warm. And tonight, for the first time in several days, Mrs. Hannah had decided to treat herself to something hot. She stepped inside quietly, stamping the snow from her shoes before making her way to a small booth near the window. The waitress, a young woman named Carla, greeted her with a tired smile. "The usual?" she asked. Mrs. Hannah nodded politely. "Just the soup, dear." Carla scribbled on her pad and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, A steaming bowl of vegetable soup arrived at the table. The scent alone made Mrs. Hannah close her eyes for a moment. It wasn't much, but to her, it felt like a luxury. She wrapped her hands around the warm bowl and took her first slow spoonful. Across the diner, the door opened again. The cold wind slipped inside with a gust strong enough to rustle the napkins on nearby tables. A man stepped through the doorway. At first, no one paid much attention. But then the room seemed to shift slightly, as if an invisible current had passed through the air. The man was tall, with a posture so straight it made him appear almost immovable. His dark coat was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked out of place. The diner was filled with construction workers, late-shift nurses, and tired taxi drivers warming their hands around mugs of coffee. But this man looked like he had stepped out of a different world entirely. He chose a seat alone near the counter and ordered quietly. Mrs. Hannah noticed him only briefly at first. But something about him lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't just the expensive suit. It was the stillness. The way he sat without fidgeting. The way his eyes moved calmly across the room, taking in everything without appearing curious. There was a quiet authority about him. A presence that didn't need to raise its voice to be felt. Outside the diner window, a sleek black car rolled slowly to a stop along the curb. Two men remained inside, watching. Mrs. Hannah didn't notice that part yet. She simply lowered her gaze back to her soup and continued eating carefully, savoring each spoonful. But in just a few minutes, the quiet atmosphere of the diner was about to change completely. The man in the dark coat sat alone at the counter, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. From where Mrs. Hannah sat, she could see only the side of his face. His features were sharp, composed, almost sculpted by restraint. He removed his gloves slowly, placing them beside his plate with careful precision. Even the smallest movement seemed deliberate. The waitress, Carla, approached him with the same tired smile she offered everyone, but something in her posture shifted slightly when she stood beside him. "What can I get you tonight, sir?" Her voice carried a faint note of politeness that bordered on caution. The man glanced briefly at the menu before answering. "The steak special. Medium rare." His voice was low and smooth, with a soft accent that Mrs. Hannah could not quite place. Carla scribbled down the order and nodded. "Coming right up." The man thanked her with a simple incline of his head. Nothing more. He didn't check his phone. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around impatiently the way most customers did. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the window where the winter wind pushed loose snow along the sidewalk. Outside, the black sedan remained parked at the curb. Inside the car, two men sat silently in the front seats. Their eyes never left the diner. But none of the customers inside noticed. Least of all Mrs. Hannah. She continued sipping her soup slowly, warming her hands around the bowl while the murmur of quiet conversations filled the diner. The steak arrived about 15 minutes later. The scent of grilled meat filled the air, rich and savory, drifting through the room like an invitation. A few of the nearby diners glanced over with mild envy. It had been a long time since Mrs. Hannah had eaten anything like that. She looked away quickly. Some things were better not to think about. The man thanked Carla again and began eating. He didn't rush. Each bite was measured, unhurried, almost thoughtful. As if the meal itself was only a small part of something else occupying his mind. Time passed. Plates were cleared. Coffee cups refilled. The steady rhythm of the diner continued. Until Carla returned with the bill. She placed the small black folder gently beside his empty plate. "Whenever you're ready, sir." The man nodded once. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. He reached for the bill, opened it calmly, and glanced inside. Then his hand moved to his coat pocket. A subtle shift. His fingers searched briefly. Then moved to the inside pocket. Another pause. A second pocket. And then another. The change was almost imperceptible. But Carla noticed it. Her polite smile faded slightly. "Everything all right?" she asked. The man's hand stopped moving. For the first time since entering the diner, he looked mildly inconvenienced. He checked one more pocket. Then slowly closed the bill folder. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, Bet I've made a mistake. Carla blinked. A mistake? I appear to have left my wallet elsewhere. The words were delivered calmly, almost matter-of-fact. But the manager behind the counter had already been watching the interaction. Arthur was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the permanent scowl of someone who had spent too many years dealing with unpaid tabs and late-night arguments. He stepped forward immediately. What seems to be the problem? Carla hesitated. He, doesn't have his wallet. Arthur's eyebrows lowered instantly. He turned toward the stranger. You're telling me you ordered the steak special, without having money to pay for it? The diner grew slightly quieter. A few heads turned. The man remained seated, his posture unchanged. That is correct, he said calmly. But if you would allow me to make a phone call, someone will settle the bill shortly. Arthur let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah. I've heard that one before. I assure you. Look, Arthur interrupted, crossing his arms. Your bill is $38. I'm not running a charity here. A couple of nearby customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The stranger didn't raise his voice. I understand your concern. However, the situation can be resolved very quickly. Arthur shook his head. Or we can resolve it right now. The tension in the room thickened. Mrs. Hannah had stopped eating entirely. Her spoon hovered halfway between the bowl and her mouth as she listened. Arthur leaned closer to the man. You either pay the bill, he said firmly, or I call the police. The word hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Police. The other diners began whispering quietly. Carla looked embarrassed. The man remained perfectly calm. For a moment he simply studied Arthur's face. Then he spoke again. You are free to do as you wish. There was no arrogance in his voice. Only quiet certainty. But Arthur wasn't impressed. All right then, he muttered, reaching for the phone behind the counter. Mrs. Hannah's chest tightened. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the memory of her husband once being humiliated by a store clerk over an unpaid bill. Maybe it was the simple fact that the man in the suit didn't look like someone trying to cheat anyone. He looked inconvenienced. Embarrassed, perhaps. But not dishonest. Mrs. Hannah glanced down at the small pile of coins on her table. $14.30. Her fingers slowly closed around them. The metal felt cold against her skin. If she paid the man's bill, she would have nothing left. No groceries. No bus fare. Nothing for the rest of the week. Her mind told her to stay seated. To finish her soup. To mind her own business. But her heart had already begun moving in a different direction. Across the room, Arthur picked up the phone. This won't take long, he muttered. Mrs. Hannah pushed her chair back. The legs scraped softly against the floor. Several diners turned toward her. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she walked toward the counter. Arthur looked up just as she approached. What? Mrs. Hannah placed her coins gently on the counter. They clinked softly in the quiet room. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'll pay for his meal. For a moment, no one in the diner moved. The coins on the counter caught the light from the hanging lamps above, small dull circles of silver and copper resting in Mrs. Hannah's thin hand. Arthur stared at them. Then at her. Then back at the coins again. You'll what? He asked, as if he had misheard. Mrs. Hannah cleared her throat softly. Her voice was gentle, but steady. I'll pay for his meal. The diner had gone quiet now. Even the cook in the kitchen had slowed his movements, glancing toward the counter through the small serving window. Arthur leaned forward, squinting at the pile of coins. You know his bill is $38, right? Mrs. Hannah nodded. Yes. And you think that little pile of change is going to cover it? A few people chuckled awkwardly from nearby tables. Mrs. Hannah felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. It's everything I have, she said simply. Arthur rubbed the back of his neck, clearly irritated. Lady, I'm not trying to be rude here, but this isn't your problem. Mrs. Hannah turned her head slightly. For the first time, her eyes met the stranger's. Up close, the man looked even more composed than before. His dark eyes were calm, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her feel strangely exposed. There was no embarrassment in his expression now. Only curiosity. And something else. Respect. She looked back at Arthur. Please, she said softly. Let me help. Arthur let out a long sigh. You're serious? Yes. He hesitated. Then shrugged with a heavy exhale. Fine. If you want to throw your money away, that's your business. Mrs. Hannah slowly opened her palm. The coins slid onto the counter one by one. Clink. 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 She counted them carefully, her fingers moving slowly as the room watched. $2. 5. 10. $14.30. The small pile sat there helplessly. Arthur frowned. That's not even half the bill. Mrs. Hannah froze. For a second, the reality of what she had done washed over her. She had stood up. Offered help. Given away the last of her money. And it still wasn't enough. Embarrassment crept up her spine like a cold wind. I'm sorry, she murmured. She looked down at the counter, wishing she could gather the coins back into her hands and disappear quietly back to her booth. But before she could move, a chair scraped softly against the floor behind her. The stranger had stood up. He walked toward the counter with slow, deliberate steps. The room seemed to shift as he approached, conversations fading into silence. When he reached Mrs. Hannah's side, he stopped. Up close, he was taller than she had realized. His presence felt steady, grounded. He glanced down at the coins on the counter. Then at Arthur. Add the soup to my bill, he said calmly. Arthur blinked. What? The man's voice remained perfectly level. The woman's soup. Add it to my bill. Arthur frowned, confused. Why would I do that? The stranger turned slightly toward Mrs. Hannah. His eyes softened just a fraction. Because she has already paid. Arthur let out a short laugh. She hasn't even covered half of it. The man nodded. That may be true. He looked down at the coins again, then back at Arthur. But I will owe her the difference. Arthur stared at him for a moment. You're serious? Yes. The manager rubbed his forehead. This entire situation had become strange enough that arguing no longer seemed worth the effort. With a grumble, he scooped up the coins and began entering the payment into the register. The receipt printer whirred softly. The transaction was done. Mrs. Hannah stood there quietly, her hands now empty. A strange mixture of relief and worry filled her chest. She had helped. But the cost would follow her home tonight. Arthur shoved the receipt across the counter. There, he muttered. Happy now? The stranger picked up the small slip of paper and glanced at it briefly. Then he turned to Mrs. Hannah. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said quietly, You did not have to do that. Mrs. Hannah looked down at the floor. It's all right, she replied softly. Everyone needs help sometimes. The man studied her face carefully. What is your name? She hesitated. Hannah. Hannah, he repeated slowly, as if committing it to memory. Then he nodded once. Thank you? The simplicity of the words carried a weight she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Hannah gave a small polite bow of her head. Then she turned toward the door. The winter wind slipped inside as she pushed it open. The cold air hit her cheeks immediately. Behind her, the bell above the diner door jingled softly as it closed. She stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk. Her pockets were empty now. Her week had suddenly become much harder. But as she walked slowly down the snowy street, she told herself something that made the situation feel lighter. At least someone had been spared humiliation tonight. Inside the diner, the man in the dark coat stood motionless for several seconds after she left. Arthur wiped the counter absent-mindedly. Strange woman, he muttered. The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the front window. Outside, Mrs. Hannah's small figure moved slowly down the street under the dim glow of the streetlights. In the black sedan parked at the curb, the two men inside sat up straighter. One of them spoke quietly into a phone. She's leaving now. The stranger slipped on his gloves. His eyes never left the old woman walking into the night. And then he said something that made the man on the phone freeze. Find out everything about her. The next few days were colder than usual. Winter had settled over the city like a heavy gray blanket, pressing its chill into every corner of the streets. The wind slipped through alleyways and rattled loose shutters, making even the strongest coats feel thin. For Mrs. Hannah, those days felt longer than most. Her small apartment offered little warmth beyond the tired radiator that clanked and hissed through the night. She wrapped herself in 2 blankets when she slept, curling slightly to keep the cold from settling into her bones. Food had become limited. The $14 she had given away at the diner had been meant to last the rest of the week. Groceries. Bus fare. A little tea. Without it, every small necessity suddenly felt like a luxury. So she adjusted. She ate less. A single slice of bread in the morning. A cup of weak tea in the afternoon. Sometimes nothing at all. It wasn't the first time she had stretched a week this way. Still, there were moments when her stomach reminded her of the decision she had made. And in those quiet moments, the memory of the diner returned to her mind. The calm stranger. The tension in the room. The way his eyes had looked at her when she offered the money. Mrs. Hannah would sit by the window and wonder, briefly, whether she had been foolish. But every time the thought appeared, another one followed. At least he hadn't been humiliated. That was enough. 3 evenings later, Mrs. Hannah was washing a single cup in the tiny sink of her kitchenette when she heard something unusual outside. Engines. Not one. Several. She paused. The sound was unfamiliar for her quiet street. Curious, she walked slowly to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Her breath caught. 3 sleek black cars had pulled up along the curb outside her building. They were long, polished vehicles, the kind she had only ever seen in television dramas or outside expensive hotels downtown. The engines shut off almost simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. Men stepped out. All of them dressed in dark suits. Tall. Serious. Silent. Mrs. Hannah blinked in confusion. Her neighbors had begun peeking out from their own windows now, curtains shifting slightly as curious eyes watched the scene unfold. One of the suited men walked to the rear door of the center car and opened it carefully. Someone stepped out. Mrs. Hannah felt her heart skip a beat. It was him. The stranger from the diner. But tonight he looked different. Not because of his clothes. They were still elegant and perfectly tailored. It was the way everyone around him moved. The men in suits stood slightly behind him, their posture alert and respectful. One of them spoke quietly into a small earpiece. Another scanned the street carefully before nodding. It was the kind of behavior Mrs. Hannah had only seen surrounding very powerful people. Her fingers tightened slightly on the curtain. The stranger lifted his gaze. And for a brief moment, their eyes met through the window. A quiet recognition passed between them. Then he turned toward the entrance of the building. Moments later, Mrs. Hannah heard footsteps climbing the narrow stairwell. Heavy. Measured. Her heart began to beat faster. No one had visited her apartment in months. A knock came at the door. 3 calm taps. She stood frozen for a second before walking slowly across the small room. When she opened the door, the stranger stood there exactly as she remembered him. Calm. Composed. Watching her carefully. Behind him in the hallway stood 2 of the suited men, their presence filling the narrow space with silent tension. Mrs. Hannah blinked. You. The man inclined his head slightly. Good evening, Mrs. Hannah. Her confusion deepened. You know my name? He offered a faint smile. It was not difficult to learn. His voice carried the same quiet authority it had in the diner. But here, standing in her doorway with several expensive cars waiting outside and men guarding the hall, that authority felt heavier. More real. Mrs. Hannah stepped back slightly. Please come in. He entered the apartment with a slow glance around the small room. His eyes took in everything. The worn furniture. The small table by the window. The empty bread wrapper in the trash. Nothing escaped his notice. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a thick white envelope. He held it out toward her. I came to repay a debt. Mrs. Hannah stared at the envelope. Through the thin paper she could see the unmistakable edges of large bills. Her eyes widened. That's too much, she said quickly. You only owed me $14. The man shook his head slowly. No. His gaze met hers again. I owed you something far more valuable than money. Mrs. Hannah hesitated. Who are you? For the first time since arriving, the stranger paused before answering. His expression remained calm, but the silence behind his eyes seemed to carry years of secrets. Finally, he spoke. My name is Sterling Kim. The name meant nothing to her at first. But somewhere downstairs, a neighbor's voice whispered through the hallway. A hushed tone filled with sudden fear. That's him, the Korean boss. Mrs. Hannah felt the air leave her lungs. She looked back at the man standing in her small apartment. The quiet stranger she had helped in a diner. The man who had forgotten his wallet. And suddenly she realized. He was not just a businessman. He was one of the most powerful Korean mafia bosses in the city. For a long moment, Mrs. Hannah could not speak. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the clinking of dishes from the kitchen had stopped, as if the entire room understood something extraordinary was unfolding. Across the table, the stranger sat perfectly still. No arrogance. No threats. No display of power. Just quiet respect. The manager shifted nervously behind the counter, suddenly unsure of where to look. Mrs. Hannah slowly placed both hands on the table. Her fingers trembled. You're telling me, she said carefully, that all of those men outside work for you? The stranger nodded once. They do. A long breath escaped her chest. She looked down at the wrinkled hands that had scrubbed floors for most of her life, hands that still smelled faintly of detergent from yesterday's cleaning job. Then she laughed softly. Not with joy, but with disbelief. I spent my last money tonight, she said, on a stranger who forgot his wallet. The stranger leaned forward slightly. I did not forget my wallet. Mrs. Hannah blinked. You didn't? No. He reached into his coat pocket and calmly placed a thick leather wallet on the table. It was full. Very full. More cash than Mrs. Hannah had likely seen in years. I wanted to see something, he said quietly. Her eyes widened. You tested us? Not the diner, he corrected. You. Mrs. Hannah's brow furrowed. Why me? For the first time since entering the diner, the stranger's calm expression shifted. Something deeper appeared in his eyes. Memory. Pain. 30 years ago, he said slowly, I was a hungry boy on a cold street in Busan. The room seemed to lean closer to hear him. I had nothing. No family. No food. No place to sleep. His voice remained steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. One night, I collapsed outside a small restaurant. Mrs. Hannah listened without moving. A woman came outside, he continued. Old. Poor. Like you? He paused. She carried me inside, gave me soup, and told me something I never forgot. Mrs. Hannah whispered. What did she say? The stranger looked directly into her eyes. She said, The world is cruel. But if you survive, promise you will become the kind man others needed. The diner was silent. Mrs. Hannah's lips parted slightly. And you remembered that? Every day. He sat back slowly. I built an empire after that night. Outside, one of the black SUVs started its engine. But inside the diner, the world felt still. I have power now, he said. Money. Influence. Then his voice softened. But kindness is the rarest thing in this world. Mrs. Hannah's eyes shimmered. I didn't do anything special, she murmured. You gave a stranger your last meal. He leaned forward again. That is special. A long pause settled between them. Then something unexpected happened. The powerful man stood up. Slowly. Respectfully. And bowed his head to her. The entire diner gasped. One of the suited men near the door whispered under his breath. Boss, you don't bow to anyone. But the stranger ignored him. His voice was quiet, but clear. Mrs. Hannah, he said. Tonight, you reminded me of the woman who saved my life. He straightened and reached into his coat again. This time, he placed something else on the table. Not money. Not a card. A small silver key. Mrs. Hannah stared at it, confused. What is that? The stranger smiled slightly. It belongs to something that now belongs to you. And the room held its breath. Because whatever was about to happen next was going to change her life forever. Mrs. Hannah stared at the small silver key resting in her palm. Her fingers curled around it slowly, as if it might disappear. What does it open? She asked. The stranger gestured toward the diner around them. This place. The manager nearly dropped the glass he was holding. Mrs. Hannah blinked. The diner? The stranger nodded. I bought it this morning. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Then he added gently. And now, it belongs to you. Mrs. Hannah's breath caught in her chest. But why would you give me something like this? The stranger looked at her the way a son might look at a mother. Because 30 years ago, someone gave a hungry boy a bowl of soup. He stepped toward the door, his bodyguards already moving outside. Before leaving, he paused. Kindness, he said softly, should never end in poverty. And for the first time in many years, Mrs. Hannah realized her life had just begun again. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can echo across an entire lifetime. Mrs. Hannah thought she was simply helping a stranger, but that one moment changed everything. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change the world.